Previously on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. We celebrated 100 episodes by bringing you the stories so far, from Marconi's yacht commentary to the BBC's first summer, which is where we find ourselves now, at odds with the government and the press. And on paper, with listeners too, they just aren't buying enough radio sets or licences. But that's because they are making their own radio sets, and there's not a licence to cover that. So the first BBC Inquiry is launched. It spans 4 months. The 10-strong panel interview dozens of witnesses before ruling on how the BBC should be going forward. It's the Sykes Inquiry, named after Sir Frederick Sykes, MP. It's nothing to do with the comedian Eric Sykes, or the TV presenter Melanie Sykes, or Sykes the dog from Midsummer Murders. I digress. This time, the Sykes Inquiry reports, giving us the Sykes Report. I don't know where they think of these names. It reported on the 25th of August 1923, and that is where we find ourselves anchored in our timeline of British broadcasting's backstory. We'll inform, educate and entertain about exactly what was decided as the way forward for the Beeb, thanks to this government inquiry, the BBC's first. This was a time the entire enterprise could have been closed down or replaced or a competitor brought in, but instead we will see how it emboldened and refocused the company John Reith was already moulding into a public service behemoth. Plus, our special guest is Dr Inja Stanović of the University of Surrey. She takes us back even further to the 19th century and to pre-broadcasting, when another audio innovation brings entertainment to our ancestors' homes. It's the recording device. Dr Stanović directs the Early Recordings Association, the ERA, and if that is your area, if you like a bit of early recording, if you're an enthusiast, a gramophone collector, you should join the Early Recordings Association. You can for free. Details on this episode and in the show notes. And they have a conference next week at time of recording. It's in Guildford at University of Surrey. I will be speaking at it, and you could come. If you're an early recordings enthusiast, that is the conference for you, and this is the episode for you. And if you're not, but you want to know more about the next chapter of the British broadcasting origin story, you're in the right place. The Sykes Report and the Early Recordings Association on episode 101 of the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Kerensa calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, welcome to episode 101. We should really have made this either a 101 type course, an introduction to the elements of broadcasting backstory. But I suppose we did that last episode with episode 100, a nice big century roundup of how we've got here so far. Or we could have made episode 101 a tie-in with Room 101 and done a George Orwell special. We must do a George Orwell special at some point with his time at the BBC. I think we'll be a while before we get to George Orwell joining the Beeb. They do say he based Room 101 on his time at the BBC. I don't think he fully enjoyed it. If you would like to see, in fact, the building that George Orwell worked in at the Beeb, you can join me on my walking tour of old BBC sites, doing it this summer, Saturday 9th of August and Saturday 6th of September, 3 p.m, steps of All Souls Church next to Broadcasting House. It's 2 miles, 90 minutes, dozen stops, end at Savoy Hill, maybe a pint at Savoy Tap Pub. Link in the show notes to that. Do join me for a meander. Did one yesterday with a lovely bunch of people. And so join us again for the BBC walking tour. Not an official BBC walking tour, we must add. Also, Camden Fringe, while I'm plugging things. I'll be there August 5th and 6th of this year, 2025. It's a Tuesday and a Wednesday, bringing an evening of very old radio to the Water Rats venue. It's near King's Cross in central London. Camden Fringe, join me, bring people, come Londoners, come all. Can't wait to do that one. You've waited long enough, though, for this episode. So let us dive into the next chapter of our moment-by-moment origin story of the early Beeb. Later we'll meet our guest, Dr Inja Stanović of the Early Recordings Association and the Early Recordings Association Conference coming soon, if you're very quick. She'll tell us all about early recordings, the tech and the history behind that very shortly. But first, the Sykes Inquiry of 1923. If you would like to hear the Sykes Report in full, join us on Patreon. We will deep dive into the entire report for gluttons for punishment who want the full works. That will be on patreon.com/Paul Kerensa. Link in the show notes. It's £5 a month. It all supports this podcast, and we would love to grow that. If you would love to join us on Patreon, we would love to have you. But on this podcast, we begin with the report. What did Sykes seek?
Broadcasting may be abolished. Is the broadcasting of amusement programmes in danger of being forbidden altogether?
Shouted the headline of the Daily Herald on the 21st of April 1923. Thank you to Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective, for this. Oh yes, it was no set thing the Sykes Inquiry would allow the BBC to continue. It may even be abolished.
Even should the broadcasting of amusement programmes continue, the Postmaster General is determined to fight to the end the establishment of a monopoly by the British Broadcasting Company.
The Sykes Committee was 10 strong. There were 4 MPs, including Sykes himself, son-in-law to the Prime Minister, in fact, Bonar Law. 2 of the representatives were Post Office representatives. There was a representative from the press, a Radio Society guy, an Army guy for no real reason, and a BBC guy. John Reith made his way onto the committee.
The PMG appointed a committee under Sykes and put me on the committee. I asked him, will you please put me on the committee? And he was criticised for that, but it made an immense difference.
I have a funny feeling that put him in a good position to sway others on a few things. This was, in fact, the only time in the BBC's history that a BBC person sat on a committee looking into itself. So this 10-strong committee met 34 times, from April 24th to August 25th, 1923, including dozens of witnesses, the first of whom were representing the General Post Office. That's the wing of the government that had somehow ended up with the remit of broadcasting. I suppose you can see the lineage. It begins with the Post Office looking after the post. That then evolves into the telegraph, which then evolves into the telephone, and that becomes wireless telephony and then broadcasting. So a bit like that game telephone, you start off with one thing, ends up with something very, very different indeed. So post and broadcasting, it's all sending stuff, I suppose. So the General Post Office was involved in administering at this point the licence side of things. And the licence problem was a very big reason this inquiry was happening at all. Part of the issue was the Post Office were not holding to account licence evaders. Do you pay your licence today? Well, in the Sykes Inquiry's first session in April 1923, the committee discovered it was Post Office policy to not prosecute offenders. According to the very first witness, R.W. Woods, that's the lawyer for the General Post Office. Now, Reith was not happy with this. He said it was one of the fundamental essentials of the agreement. If they were not going to throw the book at offenders, why would anybody pay the licence fee? Maybe you just need a few high-profile prosecutions, and that would put off the rest. There were comparisons drawn in this inquiry to dog licences. You know, you can see dogs in the street, you try and track down the owner, but can you see hidden radio sets? Well, there are roof aerials, I suppose, and unlike dogs, they don't run away. But no, there were no licence evasions really being investigated or prosecuted. So they had the licence problem to work out. But then there was the question of monopoly and disagreement over whether the BBC was a monopoly, because any radio manufacturer could join this combine, as Reith called it. The BBC welcomed them all as shareholders. But I mean, we all know that realistically, as a broadcaster, it was a monopoly. Nobody else was licensed in the country.
There were criticisms of the monopoly position before we started. I would say that they've almost entirely disappeared within 3 or 4 years.
And censorship was another big issue covered by this whole inquiry. That was particularly led by Charles Trevelyan MP. At several meetings, he wanted to know more about whether the government could or would intervene to prevent a broadcast that maybe the government would find undesirable or controversial. These were the words being used at the time. The issue really, I think, is really important because it expands to that point that we really see today. You know, whether or not a government should, could, would intervene with broadcasts it's not a fan of. Technically, at the time, the terms of the agreement between BBC and government...
The company shall transmit efficiently a programme of broadcast matter to the reasonable satisfaction of the Postmaster General. To the reasonable satisfaction of the Postmaster General, whatever that might mean.
Could the government then decide it didn't like something the BBC was broadcasting and stop it? And would the government be more likely to stop a thing that was, say, an unfavourable political opinion or something that encouraged the masses in a way it didn't want, or just, you know, a musical concert of low quality? Which do you think politicians would be less happy with? Dissent or dodgy singing? The thing is, if a government can intervene, then it might, It was an important issue certainly then. Mr. Woods of the Post Office said,
I rather doubt whether the government could intervene to prevent a concert, a lecture, educational matter, speech, weather report, theatrical entertainment, and any other such matter. They could intervene to prevent news, because it would have to be approved by the Postmaster General.
So a broadcaster at arm's reach from the government may be more preferable. But for now, the BBC had to maintain a standard. That's what they had agreed to do. And if it dropped from that standard, yes, it could be censored. Now, these are issues, of course, that would come back to bite Reith in years to come. 3 years later, in the general strike, for example, the government asked the BBC to broadcast a statement what it wants and maybe to suppress other voices against it. Similar issues came to the fore in World War II. To what degree does the BBC become a mouthpiece for the government? And to what degree is that helpful? Positive propaganda, perhaps? To what degree is it less helpful or even dangerous? Is there such a thing as good propaganda? They say that the BBC World Service today does this soft power like nothing else could. The pandemic of just a few years ago, we see once again when a broadcaster like the BBC can step in and do something, well, do we say of the government's bidding or of something helpful to the nation? It's a fine line perhaps, but those questions were coming in at this very early point with the Sykes Inquiry. And I guess this thing that was written into the agreement when the BBC began, really it's a fail-safe, I suppose, the government needed in case standards fell. Gladly, with Arthur Burrows as Director of Programmes and Cecil Lewis as Deputy and John Reith as General Manager and others on board, the standard remained high to begin with. Innovation kept pushing forward, but all of this may not have been the case. They could have gone for the lowest common denominator and just given the people what they want, rather than what Reith tried to do, give the people what they need.
Of course, I had a good many problems to decide, the chief being for whose benefit and how to get the greatest benefit.
So then there's the question of partisan broadcasting. What rules the BBC should stick to during a general election, for example. These were questions that also came up during this inquiry. But it kept coming back to the term controversy, whatever that may mean. Upstart voices unwanted by a government, perhaps? My words, not theirs. Archibald McKinstry, one of the BBC board, said to the Sykes Inquiry,
The broadcasting company wished to keep away from controversial matter and had endeavoured to do so. We do not wish to have the broadcasting stations used for propaganda, which will excite one section of the population and will be very distasteful to another.
Yeah, keep away from extremes. Farage. And bear in mind that at this point in 1923, this inquiry was happening just 2 months after this on-air, controversial political moment.
It was a debate about communism. All the comrades were there. Over the air, at the end of it, when there was a perfect riot, came the red flag in all its fury and all its glory. And what a row there was about it.
Peter Eckersley reflecting on a controversial political moment.
And that was one of the most dramatic occasions that I can remember.
So the BBC was keen to say to the Sykes Inquiry that they were trying to avoid further political extremes on the air. Tightrope to tread. So then there was the question of the press. There were many press representatives as witnesses to the inquiry. Many were trying to clip the wings of the Beeb. No news gathering, thank you. That was always part of the agreement. You must read what the news agencies send you, and nothing more. This was to protect the interests of the newspapers. It was noted by Lord Riddell, on behalf of newspaper proprietors, that
attempts have been made to secure permission to broadcast the boat race.
Speaking from memory, it was 1927 when we broadcast the boat race from a launch for the first time.
I think Cambridge are ahead. I don't know who's ahead. It's either Oxford or Cambridge. It's neck and neck the whole way.
The King's Speech.
I am enabled this Christmas Day
and other outstanding incidents occurring before the authorised time for broadcasting news.
A no-no for the press. Also, therefore, no racing or football result. There was a premonition of Sky Sports in pubs, I like to think, when the press rep Lord Riddell said to the inquiry, as an example,
well, a publican with a broadcaster would be able to supply the requirements of his customers, who'd be eagerly waiting in the bar for the results.
No, not good for the newspapers, so they were keen to make sure that didn't happen.
You're trying to take the bread out of our mouths,
Lord Riddell said to Reith, at the suggestion of broadcasting parliamentary debates. This was something that Arthur Burrows had dreamt of since his mission statement of broadcasting back in 1917. So the delay in bringing us Parliament and sport, a lot of that was down to the newspapers insisting that was their territory. And the press were finding they couldn't get involved in this broadcasting industry, much as they may have tried. The anti-BBC Daily Express had applied for a broadcasting licence, but in the words of F.J. Brown of the Post Office to the Sykes Inquiry,
the Postmaster General did not want to give facilities to one particular newspaper or organisation which he could not give to other newspapers and organisations.
Sorry, no Daily Express radio. Times Radio just had to wait a century or so. As the inquiry continued through summer of 1923, there were early calls to move the BBC out of private hands, run by radio manufacturers, and into public ownership. This was not a majority voice at this point, but inquiry witness Herbert Morrison of London County Council said,
"Instead of being in the hands of a partially controlled but otherwise irresponsible private monopoly, it should be publicly owned and controlled."
A sign of the corporation to come. Herbert Morrison there would go on to become Deputy Prime Minister and grandfather to Peter Mandelson MP. Now, as we know, in 1927, the British Broadcasting Company became a corporation and Herbert Morrison got his wish. But for now, the inquiry was more focused on other areas, and it was dragging on a little, if you can't tell by the way that I too am dragging on a little. We'll have a guest soon to break the monopoly of me, I promise you. Did I say monopoly? I meant monotony. So Reith wanted this hurried along a little, and he wanted the Sykes Inquiry to deliver some sort of interim verdict, just focusing on the licence problem, so the BBC could get going and maybe generate some income.
Probably the greatest evil arising from the inexcusable delay in effecting a settlement of the licence questions is the setback given to a new and important British industry.
Wireless Weekly, 13th of June 1923.
When we see that only after 6 weeks is the representation of the listeners in called to give evidence, and when we see the whole industry declining, 10,000 workers thrown out of employment while the committee hears evidence, we feel something must be done. The programmes are good, the weather is bad, the industry should be flourishing. Unsatisfactory progress by the committee.
And the Westminster Gazette 10 days later.
The delay is unwarrantable. The committee was set up primarily to settle the licence difficulty. Why cannot they make some sort of report on that item, leaving the other subjects for subsequent reports, if officialdom will adopt these methods?
Could the Sykes Committee get the ball rolling on a new, simpler licence? But no, Sykes wanted a longer inquiry that looked at all of it, including whether it was right to have just one BBC. The Post Office claimed that they did the fairest thing to bring radio manufacturers together under one BBC umbrella and not just dole out licences to a handful of the biggest, loudest radio firms. Fairness was key. Lord Gainford, BBC chairman, said he only took up that role on the condition that no one radio manufacturer was given an advantage over another. The BBC was there to serve all of them. The key voice in this was John Reith. He was the one on the committee defending the cause of the radio manufacturers and saying, yes, we should have one BBC, and no, the newspapers and the like should not be allowed to join us in this broadcasting enterprise. Reith's defence of all this went down rather well with Godfrey Isaacs of the Marconi Company. He was on the board of the BBC. This is part of the reason that Reith is then promoted from general manager to managing director of the BBC and then soon director general with even more powers.
All the directors were members of the wireless trade, but they had left me virtually full freedom of management and allowed me to manage the BBC in the interests of broadcasting and of the country.
At the end of the Sykes Inquiry, the BBC bosses declared in one meeting,
"In the opinion of the board, Mr. Reith acted with fairness, moderation and great skill. It is their opinion that their interests could not have been in better hands, whatever the result of the inquiry may be."
Now the inquiry has concluded. Before they give their report, I think it's about time we met our guest for this episode. A change of tone, a change of era. We're going back even further. Our guest you can now hear on piano with an authentic reconstruction of early recording technology. Part of her enthusiasm is to recreate early recordings as they would have happened. As we now hear with a waltz from Chopin, from her album Austro-German Revivals, Reconstructing Acoustic Recordings. They're using the same technology that early recordings would have used. Period instruments, historically informed performance practices, made just how it used to be. On piano, our guest,
Surrey Future Senior Fellow and Director of Performance, Dr Inja Stanović. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's the longest title.
And early recordings is your thing, isn't it?
Yes. I fell in love with early recordings many years ago. I was doing my PhD at the University of Sheffield, and I did my PhD on Chopin in Britain, right? And after 2 chapters of Chopin reception, and while it was why it was, warm, cold reception throughout the whole 19th century, I got stuck. And I just got stuck, and I didn't understand how this musicological work is impacting me as a performer. It was really interesting to read. It was really interesting to do the research, but it was not helping me to perform his pieces. And I got a fellowship, Australian government award for like a postdoc. And I went to Australia, to Sydney Conservatorium, to work with a man called Neil Perez Costa. And he showed me the early recordings, and I was completely, like I never heard something like that.
Wow.
It was, 80s, 90s cylinders, and we listened to a lot of piano rolls, and I then included them into like case studies on early recordings in my PhD, and I can't imagine my life without them. I really love them. It's just every aspect.
Brilliant.
Of them.
So it unlocked something.
It unlocked something. It became for me something which we often miss, is that link. I like research, but I'm also a performer, and I really miss that link between research and performance, and they are that missing link for me.
So there is that difference then between the recordings made then of those pieces and then your recording you would hear now. What's the difference in terms of for a listener or knowing that it's anchored in that period?
So I specialized in acoustic recordings, so the recordings which were made before 1925, before electric recordings. Then you have electric recordings between 1925 and 1945, which I also work with, but they are different. They have a different set of problems. So now early recordings are really great because they are a completely different sound world. Performers didn't have the same issues what we have nowadays. So for example, in piano playing, it's common that we have, like in jazz, for example, nowadays, that you don't play your hands together. Left and right hand are very rarely together. You have bass and then you have the melodic line, which creates some kind of flow, which is different. And it is kept in jazz, but it's not kept in classical music anymore. They will also give you different types of rubato, different tempo and rhythm reading. It was normal to cut text, to kind of improvise. So it's much more free in our eyes, ears.
So when are we talking about the start of this era then? When are the earliest recordings?
Well, the first recordings were made in 1877, but they were made in a way that you could record, but you couldn't play back stuff, And then the first phonograph,
It's unfortunate, isn't it?
Yes, a bit. But the first classical music and other types of music recordings started in 1890s, in early 1890s. So these recordings were registered on something we call wax cylinders. Wax cylinders then were 2 minutes, and you had these machines called phonographs to play them, and phonographs also can record the sound. So it depends if you have a recorder, like a cutter or reproducer, what end of your thing in the phonograph you use, so you can record yourself, and then you can also play it back. They were invented for basically for companies, for like voice messages and stuff like this. And then people realized, oh wait, we can do some music with this.
Is that right?
Yeah. Then of course everything like boomed because it was such a major thing. The wax cylinders soon went from 2 minutes to 4 minutes up to 8 minutes. Wax cylinders, and then in 1900 you have, or just a little bit before, and in 1899 you have discs, and now discs are different type of a technology, but still with no electricity, and discs are kind of won the battle, even though cylinders are cleaner. There is no as much background noise at that time. Then with the discs, they were longer, but the discs were stackable. You could store them in a more convenient way. We have cylinders all the way until even during the electric era, but then the discs kind of won the battle of popularity, and the rest is history. What we have.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, it is. I mean, in our own lifetime, you can see how. I saw that thing online recently of someone saying, what's happened? We used to have records, LPs, and then we were told there's this new thing, the cassette come along, and then the disc, then the CDs, and now this condensed MP3, and now not even that. Now it's Spotify and streaming. And where's our music gone? So but this physical media, it matters so much.
It does, and we need to kind of understand. And I think that people who live now are, witness so many changes, and these changes are nothing new. So that changes were there also in the 1890s, where you have this phonograph, that phonograph. Is it 2 minutes? Is it 4 minutes? Oh, it's a disc. It's and discs are also 7-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch, and then you have Pathé, which is doing completely different type of discs and stuff like that. So, and then you have reproducing piano rolls, pianolas. There is, I think it's in human nature to explore carriers of sound. And once we started in the 1890s, we were unstoppable. I do believe that where we now at, it will change. It will change in 10 years' time. These will all be obsolete. And I might not be the best person to ask about this because I love these old machines.
Yes,
and
of course.
I don't collect.
Right.
I don't collect discs because I have quite a few, but I think it's a dangerous thing to start doing. If I'm researching on them and collecting, I think that
that's true.
I would not have a house to live in.
It's a worry, isn't it? We know what it's like on this podcast to be a fanatic and go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Don't come out
I
again.
have interest in that, so it's very bad for me to have my interest and the kind of buying power on the same page.
Could bankrupt you very quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so what else do we need to know about the state of research? And you've recreated sound recordings, haven't you?
These are not early recordings themselves, but a reconstruction of them. And our guest, Dr Inja Stanović, is on piano, Dr David Milson is on violin, and they are reconstructing historic recordings of Austro-German classical music, using the same technology and instruments used in the first recordings of this music, including this, Mendelssohn's Song Without Words.
How it's done is that you record it on wax blanks, and then you have to take the wax blank, you can't hear it back. Because otherwise the groove gets destroyed.
Okay.
So the ones, the blanks you want to process, you can't hear back, right?
Okay.
And then you take the wax blanks, and then my engineer Duncan Miller does his magic and produces actually full disc. And then a month later, I can hear myself play.
So it's like the old days of taking a photograph. You used to take it to the chemist, and 3 weeks later you could see the photograph.
Yes.
Similar with the recording, you've got to wait.
Yes, and it's nerve-wracking for a musician. A lot of things, what you think that you did really well, you didn't.
And you won't know.
And you will not know. And after my first recording session, I couldn't sleep for weeks because you just think, you put so much on that. And and there is also an album. I'm very keen advocate of free sources. I think that knowledge should be free.
Yeah, democratize it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I recorded an album with a colleague of mine called Dr. David Milson, who specializes in violin performance. And this album is a free source. It's a free to download. It's completely free to access. I think it's called Reconstructing the Recordings, like Reviving Austro-German Traditions or something like that. I forgot how my own album is called.
Austro-German Revivals, Reconstructing Acoustic Recordings. Link in the show notes, or you can put that into your search engine of choice. We'll hear more from Dr Inja Stanović later on, but let us return to 1923's Sykes Inquiry. At the end of its 4 months of meetings and witness statements, August 1923, it concluded. It's looking into the licence problem, the monopoly status of the BBC, censorship, the press, and it's ready to report. Well, that said, the report was done end of August. Took another 2 months before it delivered its verdict publicly, thanks to behind-the-scenes wrangling between Reith and the General Post Office, working out whether the BBC could accept the Sykes report as it was, and which parts, and various other negotiations. Wireless Weekly, 8th of August 1923, revealed one minor early scoop from the inquiry. The only conclusion of the Broadcasting Committee, which Mr Reith has so far divulged, is that the term listener in is to be abandoned, and the term listener employed instead. Technically speaking, people do not listen in. Such an expression is meant to mean the interception of messages between two other parties.
As indeed occurred at the start of broadcasting. See episode 1 of this podcast for further details of why listeners in were listening in. But now they were just listening, so they're listeners. But the Sykes report's major conclusions leaked to the press as well. The Daily Herald, 24th of August 1923.
One uniform licence for all. No tariffs. The licence shall, it suggested, cost 10 shillings, of which 7 and 6 will go to the BBC.
Yes, licences. That's the main visible outcome of the Sykes report. By the time the inquiry began in early 1923, there were 200,000 radio owners with no licences whatsoever because they couldn't really get one. They were making their own sets or importing foreign-made goods. In fact, go back even earlier. The first 2 months of the BBC at the end of 1922, there were 6,000 experimental licences issued and 12,000 ordinary licences issued. So that's like a third, apparently, not listening to wireless concerts as such, but wanting to experiment with wireless kit. Except they weren't. They were using this largely to, listen to those concerts on the BBC. So they contributed no royalty payments on sets bought because their sets were homemade with imported parts. None of this was helping the British radio industry, nor the BBC's funding. So the Sykes report scrapped the royalty scheme altogether. It was not practical to fund a broadcasting company based on listeners buying the right set, stamped with the right BBC logo. So how do you fund the BBC then? Well, we're still wondering that today. There was a thought to add it to general taxation, but the Sykes report concluded,
if practically every taxpayer were a listener, there might be no injustice in meeting the cost of broadcasting out of taxation, but under existing conditions, it would not, we consider, be right that the general body of taxpayers should be required to pay for the daily service, which only those possessing wireless receiving sets can enjoy.
It doesn't mean the daily service as in the religious broadcast that I still contribute to on Radio 4 Extra today. No, the religious daily service didn't arrive for another 5 years. No, this is the regular day-to-day service of broadcasting, which is not to be funded by a tax, they decided, nor advertising. That was considered by Sykes & Co., but again, newspapers firmly shouted this down. If the Beeb could advertise, that would affect the newspaper's ad revenue. The Sykes report chose a different reason, though.
Advertisement would lower the standard, make the service unpopular and defeat its own ends.
Let the newspapers have that unpopular, lower standard ad jungle. Don't know how the press felt about being demeaned like that, but they got their way. No ads on the Beeb. But Sykes said,
we consider, however, that there would be no objection to the operating concern being allowed to accept the gift of a concert and to broadcast a preliminary announcement giving the name of the donor, and also to broadcast the name of the publisher and the price of a song which is about to be broadcast.
Sponsored programmes to come then. In fact, during the Sykes Inquiry itself, Lord Riddell, representing the press, criticised the BBC for having had a sponsored concert already. We featured it on episode 73.
Don't let them scrap the British Navy.
The Harrods-sponsored broadcast by the Co-Optimists comedy troupe, 26th of April 23. Lord Riddell thought it illegal. But now the Sykes report allowed for such a thing. And indeed, the Beeb managed 8 such sponsored concerts in 1925, broadcasts funded by newspapers. The Evening Standard, News of the World, Daily Herald, Weekly Dispatch, Daily Graphic, Answers magazine, and Titbits magazine, all sponsored programmes on the famously ad-averse BBC in 1925. The Sykes report specified the BBC could earn money from these if
it is necessary to find supplementary sources of revenues.
And it was. And I wonder if it is again today, 100 years later. This podcast, by the way, is sponsored by our supporters on patreon.com/Paul Kerensa. Thank you, patrons. There was also a provision in the Sykes report for the BBC to broadcast commercial information in code to be deciphered by certain subscribers' kit. No idea how that would actually have worked. It never actually happened, but it was allowed to happen to earn the Beeb some extra money. So with no royalties on radio sets sold, the Sykes recommendations was that the BBC got a bigger chunk of the licence fee.
After much argument and against much opposition and obstruction from Post Office and Treasury, the proportion of the licence revenue was adjusted.
Not 5 shillings in every 10, but 7 shillings and 6. And that also gave an incentive on the BBC to grow its listenership. The better the quality, the more listeners, the more licence fee revenue. And to keep it simpler, this would be one licence to rule them all, eventually.
The interim and constructor's licences at 15 shillings each, in addition to the ordinary receiving licence at 10 shillings. The interim licence applied to home constructors who had already made their sets and had been unable to obtain licences of any kind and were thus pirates.
You'll not be charged for past free use of your set, nor do you face any prosecution for previous licence evasion.
The constructor's licence was for those who were about to build sets.
BBC Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley.
One time down at Plymouth, I remember as we drove up to the station, we drove past the post office, and there was a queue waiting to pay their licences. And never have I felt prouder in my life.
And sure enough, listeners bought these new licences in droves. Within 10 days, they went from 180,000 licence holders to 414,000, half of which were for these interim licences. Listeners were happy to pay, it seemed. Now there was a licence suited to the home constructor.
And both these special licences disappeared at the BBC's suggestion in June 1924.
At that point as well, the ban on foreign-made parts would be dropped. Listen however you like, on whatever set you like, just pay that licence fee. As for companies' membership of the broadcasting company, don't forget they could become shareholders, and this was now broadened out to ease some of the grumbling accusations of monopoly. No longer then just for radio manufacturing firms, Sykes confirmed that
any dealer in or retailer of wireless apparatus in this country should have a right, such as is now possessed by manufacturers only, to obtain at least one £1 share in the BBC.
In fact, hardly any dealers joined the BBC as shareholders. 77 did in the next 2 years, compared with 1,700 member firms in total. Another thing was
adequate representation on the board should be secured for the new membership.
So less dominance by the big six wireless firms, maybe, the start of the BBC's journey from private to public over the next few years. This is your BBC, eventually. In another move towards this, the Sykes report recommended a broadcasting board with an independent chairman and a dozen members to
advise on such questions as who should operate broadcasting, how many stations, how revenue should be raised and allocated, the general character of the matter to be broadcast, and what regulations are necessary to prevent interference, the authority to whom complaints and suggestions could be sent.
The Sykes Inquiry did consider state operation of broadcasting, but they rejected it, literally stating that
a government department would not be a suitable body to undertake the entertainment side.
You're telling me. Now on BBC One, Strictly Come Dancing, produced by the Home Office. Although Ed Balls, Jackie Smith and Anne Widdecombe have all lambarded their way onto our Saturday nights at some point. The report stated too that a government which had to select the news themselves and talks
would be constantly open to suspicion that it was using its unique opportunities to advance the interests of the political party in power.
Yeah, the report seemed less bothered about the potential corruption and bias, more bothered that
the endeavour to avoid anything in the slightest degree controversial would probably succeed in making its service intolerably dull.
In other words, if cabinet ministers are choosing the news, they play it so safe it wouldn't be worth listening to. The Sykes report confirmed the BBC would be the only licensed broadcaster until at least the end of 1924, though it did allow for the right to license other broadcasters after that point if the government wanted to. Yes, competition to the BBC. Of course, it didn't happen for many more decades, but it could have done. These competitors would also be given a share of the licence revenue if the BBC itself had not provided satisfactory broadcasting. So there's a motivation for you, Auntie Beeb. Deliver the goods or you may gain a competitor. The BBC's own licence was extended by another 2 years, from its original expiry at the end of 1924 to the end of 1926, which, as we now know with hindsight, is when the British Broadcasting Company ended and the corporation began. So at this moment in the Sykes report, the BBC's future shift into public service broadcasting was taking shape.
I felt strongly that it should be turned into a public corporation, the first of its kind.
One thing the report did not do was defend the British radio manufacturers against foreign imports, which Reith argued wasn't in the spirit of the original agreement, which said that it would protect the domestic market. But generally speaking, the entire Sykes report was seen as a good compromise. The BBC gained licence revenue, but its board of radio manufacturer bosses did lose a bit of the protectionism for their firms. The threat of a competitor, the Beeb, was also still there. But I think all of this report really was a show of confidence in Reith's BBC. This government-backed inquiry didn't conclude that the government should take it over, and it didn't conclude a competitor should instantly come along. It allowed whatever monopoly status the Beeb had to continue for now. Better funded, in fact, with one simpler licence. The Sykes Inquiry helped safeguard a future with a broadcasting board, and Reith did so well defending the BBC, he was promoted. The BBC's shift from private to public was underway, culminating in its unique corporation status 3 years later. For now, the company years continued, though, as will we next time, picking up with simultaneous broadcasting. That's the next thing in the BBC story. Came along the same week as the Sykes Inquiry concluded its inquiring. So that's next time on this podcast. But this time, let's have one final visit to the University of Surrey, where I met our guest, Dr Inja Stanović. Now, that same University of Surrey hosts the Early Recordings Association Conference this July 1st to July 3rd. I'll be speaking in the very first session on Tuesday 1st of July on the earliest BBC recording, First Monarch on the Air. Join the Early Recordings Association to tell us more about it. The pianist that you hear now, Dr Inja Stanović.
Because I'm doing all this research with the early recordings, I started to play differently. And that really influenced my practice. And I play in this, using this kind of like, I call that modernist style, because it's 19th century techniques through me. So I was not born in 19th century, so it is historically informed, but it's also, I'm a channel of that. I have my own piano, which is Streicher from 1881. So a lot of concerts I play on historical instrument as well. If you want to hear how these performances are coming to life, so we have a bunch of concerts lined up. So if you watch this space. I find making recordings nerve-wracking.
Right.
Just the fact that now I feel comfortable because you're recording this on your phone.
Okay.
And I'm used to seeing phones.
Yeah,
but
that's
the
true.
moment you put a microphone in my face, I go like.
That's it. I'd not even considered that. And I should say, for the benefit of the home listener, this is recorded on an iPhone. Normally, I record on a microphone plugged into my computer, which I've left at home because I lugged here we're at the University of Surrey right now, and I brought my gramophone player, which is giant and vast, and we've had a look at that. And I thought, I can't bring my laptop as well. And here we are with the phone. But the joy of it, I know a lot of podcasts who record on a phone just because it's so easy. It's in your pocket. You bring it out and you're there. You know.
So I don't feel so pressured because there is also the fact that you're holding your phone is something very normal because we all hold our phones all the time.
Yes.
So this is great. So I hated recording process.
Right.
It's you can play super well and then somebody surrounds you with microphones and it's like your stress levels go through the roof. So I was thinking, how is this process done? If there is no electricity, there are these funky machines, there's wax, there are all these things I don't know anything about. What is the process? And I started to think, okay, so I want to understand what they went through because in the 1890s, all these processes were completely brand new. And people saw these machines for the first time and they did that for the first time in history. So it's very similar to where I am at. I've never been recorded on a phonograph before I started doing my research. And I got a fellowship, Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship, which was really nice, generous grant to do my research for 3 years. And I did a first systematic study on how we record on using phonographs and then gramophones as well. I developed with my husband, who at that time was at University of Sheffield, now he is at University of Arts in London, a method. It's called historically informed recording. And that method is like methodology in research is that how do we choose a phonograph? What do we need? How do we angle it? What do we need to do? What kind of piano? What kind of voice? All of those things, because all of my empirical research is also recorded digitally. And then I compare the digital recordings with what I produced mechanically to understand what that particular phonograph can capture. And where's the cutoff in bass and which technologies we are using, which horn, what kind of length, material, what are the differences between copper horn and brass horn, for example. But then it started to play into how the performers feel. So I included colleagues. And we started to have this, we call them mechanical recording workshops. We would open this to other musicians and the general public. Because general public really likes to hear this. And why not? Academia is not something which should happen only in universities, among students.
I came to an event at the Guildford Institute, which was great. And it was an hour long, and we had performers, and you recorded them. Firstly, you spoke about the technology. And then they played, and you recorded it, and then you played it back. And you recorded us, the audience, we sang. And you gathered around, you played it back to us.
And so this is like, that would be like a mini mechanical recording workshop, in a way that it was just a presentation what these machines can do. And from this research network, which was funded by HRC, the idea for Early Recordings Association came. 250 members, which I think is really amazing because we launched it last May. When I was planning this, I thought that there would be like 30 people, who I all know.
Yes,
and
that
my
might
friends.
take time to build, but in a year.
Need researchers, students, enthusiasts, just if you like these recordings, and also collectors and people. There is a lot of non-academic audiences who have a huge amount of knowledge about these things. And I just think that we need to talk. And that era is, this platform where we can find out about these recordings. And so it's completely free. So it's not that I'm promoting something now which costs money. It's completely free. It costs only my time. We have an academic journal again. But if you are enthusiast, you can also write an academic article. We will help with publication, right? It doesn't need to be an academic to write an academic article, which I think it's really important because knowledge is knowledge. It doesn't matter if it comes from academia or not. And I had enough of this kind of elitist.
Brilliant. Good. Well, absolutely. Well, then, so anyone who's listening to this now, interested in this area, they can join. They can look. They can find out more. And where do they go? They look online, Early Recording
Association, and just you join. It's all a work in progress. It's growing daily, and it's really fun because you can go and see, look, Japanese recordings are here, and then click on that link and it will take you to, because a Japanese researcher told us, we have these recordings there. So we have also an ERA conference, 1st, 2nd and 3rd of July. Everybody is invited.
Brilliant. I hope any of your listeners who want to get involved in this can now know where to go. The Early Recordings Association conference begins 1st of July. I will be there. You could come along as well. Do see the website for details. Link in the show notes. Other things I'm doing this summer of 2025. An evening of very old radio comes to Newbury for the West Berkshire Comedy Festival, 24th of July. It comes to the Isle of Wight with a friend of the show, Tim Wonder. Join me and the Marconi historian at Bembridge Fort, Friday 1st and Saturday 2nd of August. I'll be at Camden Fringe on August the 5th and the 6th at the Water Rats venue with an evening of very old radio. So do come, Londoners, to Camden Fringe. Greenbelt Festival in Kettering. I'll be presenting God on Air, a century plus of broadcast blessings. And this autumn I'll be in Ealing and Petersfield, among other places. paulkerensa.com/tour, link in the show notes. And subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. And then episode 102 on simultaneous broadcasting, plus a special guest, will be hand-delivered through the ether to you by Pixies. We are on Substack if you would like to read some blog posts about the early BBC and how it affects today. Latest one's on Eurovision, paulkerensa.substack.com. We're on Facebook, Blue Sky, X, and if you've not rated and reviewed this podcast on Apple Podcasts, I would be glad of it. It would help give us some extra visibility, find some extra listeners for us. Don't keep us to yourself. Do rate and review us. I thank you.
The British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by me, Paul Kerensa. Original music is by Will Farmer. You've also heard Dr Inja Stanović. Archive clips are public domain as far as we know. And all that we ask is that you stay informed, educated and entertained.
And join us next time for episode 102, Simultaneous Broadcasting reaches the British Broadcasting Century.